There's one thing, what we need, Sam, we need an ambulance. We need a doctor by that scaffold there. If there's a doctor, can you get to there?
At the end of the 1960s, everything felt possible. The Rolling Stones were riding the peak of their power, and Mick Jagger stood at the center of it all, confident, untouchable, and convinced that his presence alone could move crowds in the right direction. The idea behind Altamont was simple, almost naive. A free concert, no barriers, no distance between band and audience. A gesture meant to echo the spirit of peace and unity that defined the era. It was supposed to be a celebration, proof that the Stones could give something back without losing control. From Mick's perspective, there was no reason to worry. He had calmed crowds before. He had faced chaos on stage and turned it into energy. This was just another moment where charisma would do the job. But something was different. The atmosphere felt heavier, less predictable. The scale of the event was larger than expected, and the mood of the crowd wasn't aligned with the dream being sold. Still, Mick trusted instinct over structure. The belief was simple: if things got tense, he would talk. If emotions flared, he would connect. That belief had always worked. Altamont was meant to prove that the Stones could exist without limits, without distance, without control, without consequences. No one realized yet that those same ideals were about to collapse in real time. And when they did, Mick would discover something he had never faced before, a moment where his voice no longer carried power. Before we continue, if you love the stories of Mick Jagger and Rolling Stones and want to help keep his legacy alive, subscribe to this channel, like and share. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in slowly, almost invisibly. From the stage, Mick could sense that the energy wasn't flowing the way it usually did. The crowd felt restless, distracted, harder to read. The usual feedback loop, performer to audience, audience back to performer, felt broken. As tension built, Mick did what he had always done. He spoke to the crowd. He asked for calm. He tried to guide the moment with words and presence. But this time, something felt off. The crowd didn't respond the way it should have. Instead of settling, the atmosphere grew more unstable. The space between intention and reaction widened. Mick wasn't leading anymore, he was reacting, and for the first time, it was obvious. That realization hit hard. On stage, Mick was no longer the conductor of the moment. He was watching it slip past him, unable to pull it back. His voice, once enough to redirect thousands, now struggled to cut through the noise and confusion. This wasn't about fear, it was about disbelief. How could a situation unravel so quickly? How could control disappear without warning? The answers didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was the feeling, a sudden awareness that the rules had changed. And once that door opened, it couldn't be closed. Because the night wasn't spiraling, it was already out of reach. By the time the scale of the disaster became clear, it was already too late. Altamont stopped being a concert and became a symbol. Not of unity, but of something darker, the moment when the optimism of an era collapsed under its own weight, and Mick Jagger was standing at the center of it. On stage, he looked disconnected, unsure, visibly struggling to process what was unfolding. The confidence that once defined him was replaced by hesitation, not because he didn't care, but because nothing he tried seemed to work. For the audience watching later, the image was unsettling. Mick Jagger, the ultimate frontman, reduced to a spectator of chaos he could no longer shape. The fallout was immediate. Media coverage framed Altamont as the end of something, not just a concert gone wrong, but the symbolic death of the free-spirited 60 seconds. And by extension, a serious blow to Mick's image as a leader who thrived on edge and danger. The question hung in the air: had Mick gone too far? Had the character he built finally outrun his ability to control it? That night didn't just damage a reputation, it exposed a flaw Mick had never been forced to confront before: the idea that charisma alone wasn't leadership. And once that illusion broke, there was no going back. But the real transformation didn't happen on that stage. It happened in the silence that followed. The most important part of Altamont didn't happen under the stage lights. It happened after. When the noise faded and the crowd disappeared, what remained was silence, and that silence hit harder than anything that happened during the concert. Mick was forced to face the images, the headlines, and the growing narrative forming around the event. This wasn't just criticism, it was something deeper. Altamont was being framed as a turning point, a moment where things had gone too far, and for the first time, Mick couldn't brush it off as media exaggeration or public misunderstanding. The footage didn't lie. His voice hadn't worked. His presence hadn't been enough. That realization lingered. Instead of reacting publicly, Mick pulled inward. No dramatic statements. No attempts to control the story. Just distance, reflection, and a growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted. For years, Mick had relied on instinct, the ability to read a room and bend it to his will. Altamont exposed the limits of that approach. The scale had changed. The stakes had changed. And the cost of getting it wrong was suddenly impossible to ignore. This wasn't about guilt alone, it was about responsibility. And once that idea took hold, Mick began to understand that survival would require more than charm. It would require control. What followed wasn't reinvention overnight. It was quieter than that. Mick didn't announce a new philosophy or publicly acknowledge a mistake. Instead, the shift happened internally, a recalibration of how he saw himself and his role within the band. For the first time, Mick questioned the character he had built, the reckless confidence, the idea that chaos could always be tamed through performance. Altamont showed him that chaos doesn't always listen. That realization forced a hard truth into focus. Being a frontman wasn't the same as being a leader. Leadership meant anticipating danger, not reacting to it. It meant creating distance when closeness became risky. And it meant accepting that the stage wasn't just a place for expression, it was a system that needed structure. Mick began to study what had gone wrong, not just at Altamont, but in the mindset that allowed it to happen, the absence of boundaries. The belief that energy alone could replace planning. This wasn't about losing edge or rebellion, it was about survival. And slowly, Mick began to reshape how he approached everything from performances to decision-making. What the audience didn't see was a man learning where the line actually was, and deciding he would never cross it blindly again. The changes that followed were subtle but unmistakable. Shows became tighter, more intentional, less dependent on improvisation, and more grounded in structure. The wildness was still there, but it was framed, contained, and carefully managed. Mick learned that distance didn't weaken connection, it protected it. Where he once thrived on pushing limits in real time, he now focused on controlling the environment before stepping into it. Risk was no longer something to embrace blindly, it was something to calculate. This shift didn't dilute the Stones' identity. If anything, it strengthened it. The band became more consistent, more reliable, and ultimately more enduring. Chaos no longer dictated the night Mick did. What Altamont took from him was innocence. What it gave him was longevity. By learning how quickly things could spiral, Mick gained the awareness needed to prevent it from happening again. He didn't abandon the spirit of rebellion, he learned how to survive it. And the results became clear over time. The man who once trusted instinct alone had become something else entirely, a strategist who understood that control was not the enemy of freedom. It was the reason it could continue. The shift became clearer with time. Mick was no longer just reacting to moments, he was designing them. Decisions that once felt instinctive now carried intent. Tours were planned with precision. Risks were weighed before they reached the stage. The chaos that once defined the band's image was no longer allowed to roam freely. This was the birth of a different kind of power. Mick began to operate not only as the face of the Rolling Stones, but as the mind behind their survival. He took a stronger role in negotiations, logistics, and long-term strategy. The band wasn't just performing anymore, it was being managed from the inside. To some, this looked like control. To Mick, it felt like protection. Altamont had taught him that scale changes everything. What works in a club doesn't work in front of hundreds of thousands. What feels intimate can become dangerous. And leadership, at that level, means thinking several steps ahead. This wasn't about ego, it was about responsibility. The audience still saw the same swagger, the same confidence, the same energy. What they didn't see was the structure underneath the invisible framework, keeping everything in place. Mick had learned that the only way to keep the spirit alive was to stop letting it run unchecked. And that realization quietly reshaped the rest of his career. Here's the irony no one talks about. Without Altamont, Mick Jagger might not have lasted. Had that night gone smoothly, the illusion might have remained intact, the belief that charisma alone could carry everything forward. The band could have continued pushing limits without understanding where those limits truly were. Altamont forced a reckoning. It stripped away the fantasy and replaced it with consequence, and in doing so, it gave Mick something invaluable: clarity, the kind that only comes after a collapse. The night didn't save him in the moment. It nearly ended everything. But what followed, the reflection, the restraint, the evolution, is what allowed Mick to outlast nearly everyone else from that era. Other icons burned out, others vanished when the culture shifted. Mick adapted. The disaster became a filter. It burned away what was unsustainable and left behind what could endure. The reckless confidence didn't disappear, it matured. Altamont didn't make Mick weaker, it made him aware. And awareness, more than talent or fame, is what keeps a career alive when decades pass. That's why this night still matters. Altamont is often remembered as an ending. The end of an era. The end of innocence. The moment when optimism collapsed. But for Mick Jagger, it was also a beginning. It marked the point where he stopped relying solely on instinct and started building something sustainable, where he learned that survival in the spotlight requires more than confidence, it requires foresight. The Rolling Stones didn't just continue after Altamont, they evolved. And Mick evolved with them, carrying the lessons of that night into every decision that followed. That's the real legacy. Not the chaos, not the headlines, but the quiet transformation that happened afterward. The night that almost destroyed Mick Jagger didn't save him because it was dramatic. It saved him because it forced him to grow up. And sometimes, that's the only way a legend survives his own myth. Altamont didn't save Mick Jagger in the way people usually imagine. There was no comeback that night, no redemption on stage, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. What saved him happened later, quietly, away from the cameras, when the noise finally stopped. That night exposed a hard truth Mick couldn't ignore. Charisma has limits, instinct can fail, and leadership at a certain scale comes with consequences you don't get to rehearse for. Instead of denying it, Mick absorbed it. He learned when to pull back, when to tighten control, and when to stop trusting chaos to behave. And that lesson reshaped everything that followed, not just how he performed, but how he survived decades in a world that consumed so many others. Altamont is remembered as a disaster. But for Mick Jagger, it was also a warning and a gift. Because the night that almost ended his career is the same night that taught him how to protect it. And sometimes, the moments that break the illusion are the ones that keep the legend alive. If this story changed how you see Mick Jagger, let me know in the comments. Do you think Altamont destroyed an era or quietly saved one? If you enjoy deep dives into rock history, untold turning points, and the moments that reshaped legends, like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories like this, and some of them are even harder to face.